Friends today are really more acquaintances. They're people that we know, we're aware of, but we don't really have many of those deep, resounding connections anymore with people like we used to. So I think there's this divide between those who are going to continue to live in more shallow and isolating relationships, almost like you feel lonely in a crowd because you know lots of people, but yet you don't really know anyone. On the other hand, I think we're going to see other people who are pulling away from their shallow social interactions and trying to find real community and real friendships, because there's a hunger for that many of us have, to find real true connection in this world that's beyond just a romantic partner. So I've been asked to comment on the question about friendships and relationships, non-romantic or platonic relationships, and how do we find meaningful relationships in this world? And it's a very, very interesting subject to me because it's something that I've actually studied quite a bit on, and have developed some interesting insights. I think that we are heading toward a period where we're going to see probably a sort of split between, on the one hand, people who are getting more caught up in the sort of shallow relationships that we have today. And I mean shallow in that we're all connected on social media, and of course we all see what's going on in everybody else's lives, at least what they want us to see. But we're also living in very individualized worlds. We're living in these little nucleuses of our own worlds, our own families, our own lives. And friends today are really more acquaintances. They're people that we know, we're aware of, but we don't really have many of those deep, resounding connections anymore with people like we used to. And I think it's really interesting to look at the ancients and how they treated friendship. And this is still the case in some cultures today, certainly not in the Western modern cultures, but in some of the more traditional, like tribal cultures and so forth. Some of this still exists, but the ancients had a very interesting perspective on this, which is worth exploring because it really opens up our eyes in terms of understanding the potential of what relationships can be. And I believe also they were a foreshadowing of what they will be. So I think there's this divide between those who are going to continue to live in more shallow and isolating relationships, almost like you feel lonely in a crowd because you know lots of people, but yet you don't really know anyone. On the other hand, I think we're going to see other people who are maybe not so much disconnecting, but certainly pulling away from their sort of shallow social interactions and trying to find real community and real friendships, because there's a hunger for that many of us have, to find real true connection in this world that's beyond just a romantic partner. And so when we look at the ancient relationships, the ancient sort of perspective on relationships, we have to look at the concept of covenant, because their whole sort of philosophy around relationships was really rooted in this practice of covenant. And it's worth noting that friendship to them did not mean anything at all like it does today. The word to them meant something much, much closer. It was really closer even than, say, your extended family, your brothers, sisters, parents, that sort of thing. A true friendship in the ancient sort of era was more like somebody who was almost like your flesh and blood, because essentially that was what the process of covenant did. In the process of making a covenant with someone, historically what you would do is that you would take an animal and you would sacrifice the animal, and then the blood of the animal would be shared between the two of you in various ways. Usually it would be through, putting the blood on part of you and part of the other person. But there were other ways that they did it. And then there was usually a process actually of cutting on some part of the body. It could be like usually on the wrist, you cut sort of along the lines there on the wrist. And then you'd put something in there to kind of almost create a permanent tattoo as a reminder. So when they cut the wrists, usually what happened is you'd cut the wrists and then you would grab each other arm to arm, so that the blood between you would mingle. And the idea was really to sort of create a commitment to each other that you were going to treat each other as though you were the same flesh and blood. Not just a relative, but you were, that person was part of you, you were part of them. The Native American culture called this blood brothers, and they're a more recent example. The only sort of surviving version that we have of this is actually the marriage covenant. Previously, in marriage, you didn't exchange rings. What you did was that you would cut your finger, and then you would shake hands. The blood would mingle, and then you would put something around your ring, that finger, which would then sort of create a tattoo. Once it healed over, that would be a sort of permanent mark on you that you were connected by as flesh and blood to someone else. And so we've changed that nowadays in modern marriage to the exchanging of rings, but that really wasn't what it was originally. So that's the idea, where sort of couples share this idea that they are one body, they're one flesh. And so therefore, what one person does to the other person is the same as if they're doing it to you. Well, they applied that same sort of thinking in covenant relationships with, you know, between two men, for example, in ancient tribes. When they created that covenant relationship, you treated the two families as though they were now one family. You may live in separate homes, but essentially everything that you had was mine. Everything that I had was yours. It'd be like, today, let's say that I drove a Prius and I made a covenant with you, and you happened to drive a Ferrari, and I wanted to take the Ferrari out for a drive. I wouldn't come over and say, hey, could I borrow your car? I'd come over and say, I'm taking the Ferrari out, because it would have been viewed as much as, well, that's mine just as much as it is yours. It may live in your garage, but everything that we have is held in common. Everything is shared as one family. And so there was a very sort of sense of closeness and intimacy between these two families now, that really lived to support one another in this world. And you can imagine, I sort of described the ancient periods in many parts of the world as a bit like Game of Thrones, but even worse. Could be very brutal. It could be very severe, very inhumane, completely uncivil, not at all like what we expect in the world today. So to sort of form a covenant relationship with another family meant that you had the strength of the relationship with this family behind you. So if somebody wanted to come and attack you, they knew that you were in covenant with another family who maybe were bigger, maybe they were stronger, maybe they had servants and armies and stuff like that. They would know not to harm you because this other family would be after you, and vice versa. There's a story about David Livingstone, the English-British explorer who went through Africa, who every time that he came to a new tribe, and met a new tribe, the first thing he would say to them is, let's make a covenant. In actuality, the term that they use is, let's cut a covenant. You didn't say make a covenant, you would cut a covenant, because you're literally cutting. So he'd say, let's make a covenant. So they would, each, maybe the chief from that tribe and Livingstone would cut each other's their arms, and they would shake hands, and they would now sort of treat him as part of their tribe. And it's coincidentally, the reason why, there are two things that we do in modern culture that descend from this idea of covenant making. The first is handshaking. Handshaking, of course, came from covenant making. It was the sort of arm to arm and sort of greeting someone as a friend. And so when you would extend your hand to someone, you were showing that you were a person of covenant. But the other thing that comes from previous culture is waving at people to say hello. Because if you were a person of covenant and you had the marks, the tattoos on your arms from the covenants that you'd made, when you met somebody you didn't know, you would wave to them to show that you were in covenant relationship. And so it was one of the reasons why David Livingstone was able to travel all through Africa and safely, is that every new tribe that he would meet, he'd raise his hand and they would see that he had these marks from all these covenants with these other tribes. And so they would say, okay, we can't harm him, because then, these tribes are going to be after us if we do, because you're duty bound to do so. There's another part of covenant that's worth mentioning here, and that was that the covenant was a sort of, they would read what they called the blessing and curses. So there would be a sort of agreement that was drawn up of things that would, the blessings were things that they would positively affirm to do for one another. And the curses were things that essentially punishments that they would accept for failing to uphold their part of the covenant. So it was kind of the idea that if by sort of taking these curses on yourself, you're saying, I'm taking this covenant so seriously that if I fail to protect you and your family from death or whatever, I'm willingly taking this same cost upon myself because I failed to protect you and maintain my covenant duties for you. And so it was a very serious a very serious relationship bond between each other. And so the word friendship comes from this idea of covenant. It was the friend was your covenant partner. It was like a civil partnership, but even more than that. This was your covenant partner. You were building life together. You were caring for your families together. And, you know, the idea of covenant was that if you couldn't maintain any sort of responsibilities that you had, let's say you had taken out a loan and you couldn't repay it, the other covenant partner was duty bound to repay that loan on your behalf because you together were one. So this whole thing is an experience about creating oneness. And so it's really interesting when in the Old Testament, in 2 Samuel 127, where God talks about Abraham, and God calls Abraham, sorry, it's Isaiah 41:8. God calls Abraham his friend. It was more than just, hey, Abraham's a nice guy that I like to hang out with. He's cool. We have fun together. It was, no, Abraham is my covenant friend. Anything that is done to Abraham is done to me. And the whole story of the Bible, the reason why we call it the Old Testament and the New Testament is it's actually referring to the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, because the Bible is actually a story about covenant making. There's another verse which I referenced earlier, 2 Samuel 127, where King David was talking about his friend Jonathan, and Jonathan and David were in a covenant relationship together. And David said, after Jonathan died, he was mourning, and he says, Jonathan, greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. So they really experienced friendship on a much deeper and more meaningful level than we experience today. And it's something that I think we will start to see come back, because the friendship essentially creates community. And the New Testament story with the early church in pre-Christianity days is really a story about a covenanted community, because what happened was when Jesus was on earth, he made a covenant with his disciples, making them one with him. And that covenant was sealed by his death on the cross. He was that blood that was shed to unite everyone together in relationship with one another and in relationship with the Father. As he said, I and the Father are one, and you and I are one. And this was in the Gospel of John, around about chapter 17 and 19, when he was having the Last Supper with them. And that was the start of the covenant process. It started there and it ended with his crucifixion. And so he was forming this covenant relationship with them by his blood, so that they would know what it meant to experience oneness. Now, reality is what he was doing is awakening them to the nature that was already within them, because of the fact that we are, in the eternal, we are one with the Father, and we are one with another, because we're all made of the same material. We're all made of the same fabric of life. There is no separation between you and me and between us and the Father. But we are asleep to that. We are not awakened to that. We are living in our ego mind, what Paul referred to as a sin nature, where we have this idea that we are separate from one another. It's actually actually is an illusion. Our separateness is an illusion. And so we need to be reborn in our minds into the mind of Christ, is what Paul called it, where we understand our oneness with the Father and we understand our oneness with one another. And what was interesting is after the crucifixion and the resurrection, the early church started. It talks about it in the book of Acts. And what happened was that the early church was this community where they held all things in common. They basically lived like one large family. They made sure that nobody in their family had any sort of need, had any sort of lack. They were sharing around their resources with one another to help one another out and ensure that everyone had what they needed. Everyone was looked after. Everyone was cared for. Everyone felt supported and protected. And they had this really this very clear sense of unity that they were one together. This is where Paul talks about the body of Christ, when Jesus spoke about the body of Christ when he was forming the covenant, that we are his body. And as part of one body, we are all sharing the same ecosystem of beingness together. You might be a hand, I might be a foot, but what happens to you affects me and vice versa. And therefore, it's important for me to feel that it's important for me to know that you're okay, that you're protected, that you're cared for, and for you to know that I'm okay, and for us to be able to share and help one another out. Because if you're living in a body and let's say your hand gets infected or your hand gets cut and then it starts to get infected, well, the whole body gets affected by that. It's not just the hand anymore that's affected. So what hurts you hurts me. We have this sense of oneness and connection between each other that is inseparable. And so I think that we're heading into a stage where we're going to start seeing an increasing interest and desire for people to find and live in real community. Virtual communities are great, but I'm talking about real community where people are living and building life together. They're sharing their resources together. They're helping one another. They're encouraging and building up one another. And they're people that you are building life with. And this is going to happen to model to the world what real community should look like. The rest of the world, I think, will continue in the way that things have been with shallow, loosely connected friendships. But I think we're going to see more and more that as things maybe become more difficult in the material sense, there's going to be this need of a sense of I need support in my life. I need others to help me get through life, because you can live in your own individual bubble when things are okay, when everything is fine and there's no major disruptions going on and so forth. But when things go into turmoil, you become acutely aware of just how isolated you are and therefore how vulnerable you are. And so I think there's going to be this time where we're going to start to see this emerging more and more. And I think it will be very spontaneous. I don't see it being centrally organized by any one person. I think it will become a movement of people who want to rediscover what community looks like. They want to rediscover what true friendship looks like. And friendship, and that won't be built on any sort of creed of ideals or beliefs, like they've tried to do it in the church. The church has tried to build around creed and beliefs. And what's incredible is how fragmented the church has become across thousands of denominations and constant church splits, because the center of their relationship is not covenant. The center of their relationship is a belief system. It's an ideology, and as soon as we disagree over the ideology, the relationship glue falls apart. What we're going to see is more people coming together in covenant. I don't mean making new covenants. What I mean is recognizing the covenant that they already have with the Father, the oneness that they already have with the Father, and therefore the oneness with each other. And that will create a desire to want to connect more meaningfully with other people, to share life together, and to live as one people, because this is the ultimate expression of Christ, where Jesus said, where two or three of you are gathered, there I am in your midst. The real expression of Christ is not your personal relationship with Jesus. The real expression of Christ is living together in covenant community relationship with others, because that's where we express what the kingdom of heaven looks like on earth. That's where we're able to show love in action toward one another, to show what life can really be, and therefore to inspire other people to seek that same type of life, to seek a life that is more connected and harmonious with others, to find oneness in themselves with others. And it will be an exciting time for those that are embracing this change, because we're going to move into a whole new phase and a whole new era where we will start to find real and meaningful relationships again. I don't think that this means that you'll stop using social media, we'll stop having virtual communities, or virtual connections with other people and so forth. I just think that this is something that's going to surpass that. It's something that is going to, the experience of it is going to be so profound, so fulfilling, so rewarding, that it's going to eclipse the experience that you can have with somebody just over, a Zoom meeting or, on a social media account. And I'm very excited by this period. I grew up in a Mennonite culture, as I've mentioned before, which were a pacifist, very traditional pacifist Christian group. And one of the things that really impacted me about growing up in the Mennonite culture was this sense of community that they shared. Now, it wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. There was always, town gossip going around about who did what, this, that, and the other. But it was equally also a place where there was a tremendous amount of support. If anyone was in need, the community rallied to get around that person and help them out. If a farmer was struggling, the community would come around and make sure they had what they needed. When a couple would come together, they would, the community would come and help them build a home when they got married so they could have a place to live. There was just continuous support going on and on. And it was, I could walk through our town and go into any shop, and, everyone knew who my parents, my grandparents were. And it was like, and of course, if I was ever mucking around or doing anything that I shouldn't, my grandparents would find out, and people took responsibility for one another. That's real friendship. That is really feeling a sense of solidarity and responsibility for others. And so I'm excited about what's going to happen, because I want to see this happen in an even more conscious, even more awake, experience. I want to see this happen in a way where we're seeing true spiritual community, where our connection is not material, our connection is at the heart, is spiritual, and it's recognizing that spiritual connection to the divine, to the ever living in one another, and sharing in that together. It's a very exciting time. I look forward to it with a lot of hope and anticipation, and I think we're in for some wonderful experiences together as things unfold further. So I hope that's helpful to you. Thanks for watching this, and wishing you all abundant hope and love.